Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you all back to Talking Numbers, our #1 rated podcast show for the accounting industry. We hope you've enjoyed our 21 series so far, Talking Numbers. For those of you that have joined us for the first time, my name's Paul Jansz, and I have the pleasure of chatting to some great people doing some great things in our industry. Now, having spent the last 22 years working deep within the accounting industry, whether it's here in Australia or New Zealand or parts of Asia or the UK, and certainly parts of the US, some of the challenges that continue to exist across the firms, total, and I mean total, are around team members, team member engagement. And that's one of the key things I'd like to focus on today, because whether it's well-being, whether it's culture, whether it's people, whether it's engagement, whether it's leadership, they're probably the key things that I am going to focus on today. And I have a special guest to talk to. So I've got Jodi Woelkerling from Jodi Woelkerling Enterprises. Jodi, welcome to Talking Numbers.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Sorry, that was a bit of an interesting start to that, wasn't it? I wanted to get that all across because I think it's really important as we start this session that, and a lot of firms listening to this, we've got a lot of loyal listeners, but a lot of firms, this is the area where they would probably have a fair bit of trouble, which is on the people side of things and making sure that, call it that, I don't know, new style of leadership where the culture and the people and the engagement come into it, which I think is really important as we enter a new financial year.
Absolutely.
So what I'll do is to give everyone a bit of a background. I think it's probably important that I've been now following Jodi's material for quite a while. So what's probably important is, Jodi, could you give us a bit of a background to you? And then we're going to delve into a little bit about stress and leadership and all sorts of resilience and all sorts of different key words, but what that means. So maybe give us a bit of a background on you.
Absolutely. So I specialise in working with people on their own resilience and also working on cultures and with businesses in terms of building a resilient culture. And it was funny because my work originally started on the more building individual resilience, but it became very, very obvious very quickly that culture and looking at culture and creating that resilience within the culture has such an enormous far-reaching effect that it's kind of almost gravitated towards that being the main focus of what I do.
Now let's start with that. Now, what do you describe as culture?
Very good question. It's an interesting question because it's a fairly intangible concept. I would say it's things like the vibe, the engagement, the general positivity or negativity, the amount that people collaborate, the amount that people work together to innovate, the amount that people adopt change. It's a very multifaceted term.
That's big, isn't it? When you think about all the things you just mentioned there, from vibes to engagement to positive, negative collaboration, change. Most people don't like change. That is, I think that's fairly obvious with a lot of different areas. And I think this is a part of, again, these little sessions that we run, our little Talking Numbers sessions, where there's going to be quite a number of golden nuggets. So hopefully you've got your pens and your pads. I couldn't get that right. Or you got the ability to rewind this whenever you like, because we're going to touch on a number of these key areas. I'm going to come back to that in a second in terms of the cultural aspect and probably how we can measure that. Like anything, I suppose, Michael Gerber always talk about, you've got to measure it to manage it. So we want to come back to that in a second in terms of how we can measure to where we are to where we want to be. But one of the key things, I suppose, that I know within businesses, whether you're an owner of a business or a team member of a business, I think stress is a big one. And I know that you've got a tagline, we don't have to accept stress as a way of life. What do you mean by that?
Basically, that comes out of the concept that stress has become such a common way of the way that we live our lives these days. It's almost got to the point where we don't notice it, but it has enormous and negative effects. So I'm alerting to people that it doesn't have to be the reality of the way we live our life. We can live in a state of more of a feeling of calm and in control, and resilient to the challenges that we face.
Yeah, look, to be fair, probably easier said than done. But nowadays with the financial stresses, we've had to change the way we live, and certainly being here in Victoria again, we're going through another interesting stage right now. But that's a really tough thing to also recognise and accept, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's something, it can be done though. It's a case of building up at an individual level. It's a case of building up the way that you proactively handle the stresses in your life. So it can be reducing the stresses in your life, but it's also building up your ability to actually manage them in a way that it doesn't, those stresses don't negatively impact your well-being or negatively impact the way that you function in the world. So it is definitely doable. And yeah, that's sort of one of the main things that I work with people on.
Okay, so what are some of the signs, for our listeners? Look, I'll use me as a good case study here. I never used to believe that I was stressed, although it comes out in many different ways. I've got no doubt about that. And whether it be health or whether it be well-being, whether it be the way you feel, the energy you have, there's a lot of different ways. And I'm only talking about me. I'm certainly not an expert like you. What are some of the signs that we would see if we're talking about team members and cultural side, and then creating better engagement? What are the signs that we should be looking for?
So they're quite varied, but there are some key kind of patterns in things that do come up when people feel stressed. So it can be things like, for most people, sleep gets affected. So they have trouble falling asleep. If they wake up, they have trouble getting back to sleep. So it can be quite affected in terms of sleep. It can be things like a racing mind and feeling like that as much as you try to relax and you try to switch off, you can't. It can be things like feeling on edge and feeling that you don't have that emotional control that you would like. So that can take the form of things like lashing out in emotive ways, or behaving in emotive ways, or feeling it even if you don't express it that you wouldn't like. So things like anger or upset or that sort of stuff. Now, none of these factors on their own mean stress. It's like a combination of them in your life, and the amount that they affect you, but also the amount of time that they go on for. So one of the signs, and I think a lot of people did this at the start of the pandemic, and again, you don't take any of these on their own, and there could be a lot of other factors in it. Things like looking for the quick win, easy ways to make you feel better, which aren't necessarily good for you in the long run. So things like alcohol, chocolate, that sort of stuff so going to those things to make you feel better can be a sign of stress as well, because you're looking for that way of almost self-soothing. So there's other ones as well. There's a combination of signs.
Okay, but all within balance, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm trying to think over the weekend what I was getting into. There was chocolate, there was alcohol.
That's why I make the proviso. It's none of them on their own, and they can be about something else. It's kind of like a collection of things.
Yeah, fickle. Now, just to go back to a couple of things we were talking about before with regards to culture, and I've heard you talk about a resilient culture within a business has now become an absolute critical factor to success. We're all sort of getting back on our feet, but we're still living in different times. How can you measure your culture?
I tell you what, this is such a good question. And it's the way that I look at it is a combination of both quantitative and qualitative measures. So if we look at things like quantitative, there are statistics that we have available to us already, which can be indicators. So things like staff turnover, performance of staff, that sort of stuff. You can also create quantitative measures, so things like engagement surveys and that sort of stuff. Now, with either of those, you have to be put it in the can't take them on their own. Like the point that you made before about you've got to measure it first is absolutely spot on, but you have to be careful and not just take these on their own. Because, for example, things like engagement surveys, if you're in a culture where people don't feel safe to speak their mind, they might not
Yes.
necessarily answer those engagement surveys honestly and openly. So these are all useful tools. You don't keep them on their own. So that's where the qualitative side comes into it. So things like interviews with people in the organisation, and that's not just the CEO and the key managers, it's people across the various parts of the organisation. And when you're doing those interviews and there is that trust and feeling of anonymity, so that they know that anything that they say will not be pinpointed directly back to them. So if you create that trust, it gives you a really good snapshot of where qualitatively wise how people are feeling within the organization. And the even less specific things like general observations around the organization can be really useful. Now it's harder in a working from home environment, but things like looking at the way that people interact, the general I said vibe earlier on, the general vibe of the organisation. Are people enthusiastic? Are they friendly? Are they walking around with a smile on their face? Are they, so that general observation thing in an organisation can make a big difference as well. So I look at it very much as a mixture of that qualitative and quantitative, piece it all together and work out an assessment based on all of it as to where we're at, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what are the areas of improvement.
Yeah, because I think sometimes, as leaders, let's call it, of organizations, it's a difficult one because sometimes you may be good at gathering the information, but then what do you do with the information? And I suppose being in positions like this before, it's really important not to be reactive, but to be proactive. And what's your thoughts on the two different styles of that? Because that can have an adverse reaction to the people that, like you said before, if they don't feel like they can openly speak to you and trust you, and then without that going and being betrayed, well, that's a cultural killer as well, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Which is why when measuring it, it's a combination, as I said, of like the qualitative and quantitative, because if people don't feel safe to be able to speak up openly, that's a major red flag in terms of that there is an issue culturally.
And in today's world, I think certainly within the accounting industry, I had a chat a few weeks ago from a recruitment point of view, and we were talking about the people, and it's a phenomenal one because we're in a shortage. There's a shortage of really good people. The amount of accounting firms that I speak to all the time and say, oh, by the way, PJ, if you know of anyone that's looking to move, let us know. We're looking to hire. And so therefore, your comment before in terms of staff turnover is a really good one. So you want to encourage people to come and work for you rather than turn them over, because as we all know, I know back 10, 15 years ago, we used to survey this a lot with our accounting firms, and the cost to replace someone is huge. And to all of our listeners, again, if you're not sure about what it costs to replace a person within your business, I think the stats back 10, 12 years ago would have been close to $85,000. So now it would be even greater than that if you think about the relationship as well. So it's a really, really important one to work on. And I think as we move into the new financial year, you've got an opportunity to look at that and how you can actually take positive steps forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Um,
You're absolutely spot on that the cost of replacing somebody is enormous, and the higher the skill of the job, the higher that cost is. The more that there's, as you said, the relationships with customers, the higher that cost is. So you're spot on.
Now, to delve again, we'll go back a bit to go forward, and that was we spoke about a word called resilience. What does that mean to you? You know, it's been something that's building resilience into a culture. There's so many different levels. But what does that mean to you in terms of resilience?
Yep. There's always going to be challenges that we face. So resilience to me is about being able to weather those challenges, and weather them in a way that you're either staying calm and in a state of well-being, or if that is kind of getting out of control, you catch it um, before you go to that extreme state of it affecting calm and well-being, either at an individual level or a business level, and bringing it back to center, or back to calm, back to in control. So it's about weathering those challenges.
And is that just a matter of making sure that you know, as an owner of a business or a leader of a business, you're just not, let's call it, and I see this quite a lot in terms of just you're not back to back to back to back to back to meetings from 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. and you're actually giving you time, you're giving yourself time to smell the roses to a certain degree.
Well, that's absolutely one of the management strategies for how to recenter yourself and keep yourself in that state of calm. Time management is a major part of it.
Yeah, because I think most people just get, oh, well, I'm busy. I need to do. I need to do. I need to do. I need to do. I need to keep going, keep going, keep going. And again, you hear these things around policies of, you know, open door policies, and I'm here and I'm available. Well, that's in itself is an interesting one, isn't it? Because if people see you that you are stressed, they will not come and knock on your door and say, "Hey, have you got 5 minutes?"
Absolutely. And this is why building resilience in our leaders is so important as well, because leaders set the tone of the team. And you're spot on. If they see the leader as looking stressed, they won't raise things. They won't come with suggestions. They won't come with concerns. Yeah, so you're absolutely spot on.
Interesting, interesting. Now, I know you have been working on a new book because I saw this before and we were talking about this, world-class leadership. Tell me a little bit about that. Tell me what made you want to write this and what's it based on?
Okay, so basically, it's focused on helping senior executives to create that enduring, resilient culture. So that's around building a culture that is positive, productive, collaborative, and in the end, of course, building that culture is profitable, which it's worth still mentioning that, because people who work well and people who are happy working together, they are generally going to be more productive, and it's going to drive profit. So it's basically giving critical insights to leaders around those key things that I see come up as cultural issues. So what's driven me to write it? It's almost been an evolution of my work. It's interesting. As I said, I first off focused on working from an individual point of view of people building their own resilience, but it's just become increasingly obvious to me that the culture is where that huge impact comes from. So it's basically looking to share that awareness, share that knowledge, let leaders know that they're not just on their own with this. Because it's very easy as a leader to become siloed and go, oh, okay. but the patterns that come up are so common. And yeah, it's basically about sharing that knowledge. And what's it based on? It's based on a combination of my experience in the corporate world, because I've spent a lot of my working life in managerial positions in the corporate world. It's based on my experience working with business on a consulting basis, and it's based on a lot of the human knowledge kind of training that I've received. So it's a combination pretty much of my whole working life to now, and how it's developed over time.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, our audience is accounting, public practice accounting firms. Are they any different to any other industry that you've had experience with?
There's always differences depending on industries, because there's different things that are nature of different industries, but there's also a lot of similarities. So the things that can be different are things like how demanding the customers are, things like the effects on the customers of any delays, communication breakdowns, errors, that sort of stuff. Things like the amount of collaboration needed, the pressure, time, deadlines, market pressures. So these are the things that change depending on industry. So if you look at something like accounting, high regulatory, because you're answering to laws. You've got high customer demand, so the customers in a lot of cases can be quite demanding, and you've also got fairly large ramifications of errors or delays. So they're the particular things in terms of accounting which are going to be different to say like a tech industry. But as I said, there are similarities and there are differences. So
yeah, looking at, and I think that's always the interesting thing. And I think for our public practicing accounting firms out there that are listening to all of this as well, I think it's ever evolving as well. And, the last 12 months has proven that from a point of view of maybe it is that care factor. We need to be asking better questions of our team members, building better relationships with our clients. It's the ability to just ask questions, not necessarily, and be authentic to say, hey, I don't have all the answers, but you've got to ask the question first, don't you?
Absolutely. And that going, I don't have all the answers, actually a really key thing as a leader as well.
Yeah, and then I think that's something that just people just think because you're the owner of the business, or you're the CEO, or you're the partner at the accounting firm, do you have all the answers? You're better off saying, hey, I don't have all the answers, but we can work on it together. And if I need to seek more help, I could, or better advice, I can. Or do you think that's a good approach?
Absolutely. Because the thing is too, is if you say, listen, this is what I think, but I'm not 100% sure. I would really like your input and your help. Most people as employees will put up their hand and help if they're asked, but they mightn't necessarily put up their hand and help if they're not asked. So that vulnerability and enlisting that team group dynamic is so important. And you've got very successful people in business who have very much been proponents of this. So somebody like your Richard Bransons of the world.
Yes.
Yeah, it's about showing that vulnerability and going, these are the things that I need your help with, please give me your opinion. Because you've got, especially if you're talking about accounting firms, you've got some very intelligent, successful people there. My gosh, if you're vulnerable and say, I need your help, you're a lot more likely to be able to tap into their knowledge and experience. And that's a lot more than your own.
Spot on. And I think that, again, to come back to a word you used before, that's collaboration. So
Absolutely.
The ability to sit back and I think for leaders out there as well, a lot of people think that, you need to make a decision on the spot. There's also nothing wrong in saying, hey guys, let me just think about that for an hour or so and let me come back to you, as opposed to, you need to make a decision on the spot and it needs to be immediate. I think that's where different leadership styles come into to it culturally as well, because therefore, yeah, you're also displaying to your team members that it's okay just to take some time to think about it.
Yep.
You may want to do some research. You may want to have a chat to a Jodi. You may want to do a lot of different things, which then allows you to make a better decision rather than it being a reactive decision.
Absolutely. And you're also giving them the permission to do that as well.
Yes, more importantly, that's exactly right. And I think, given our accounting industry, a lot does come back down to research, whether it's it could be a complex tax issue. And you're not going to have all the knowledge, and you've got to seek a little bit more help or advice at a different level to actually get that. Try and apply that. So to our listeners, try and apply that same thought process to how you would do that within your team and your culture. I think it's a very, very good point.
Mm.
With regards to, let's call it, again, businesses working hard to build resilience into the culture, what's your advice? And I know I've had this in the past, definitely from my coaching days, and it is, how do we tackle, hopefully we've got enough time for this, Jodi, how do we tackle a high-performing team that may not be great for culture of the organisation?
Yep. I would tackle it very similarly to the way you would tackle cultural concerns. I would tackle very similarly to the way you would attack and approach performance concerns. Now, what I mean by that is, if you look at a high performing team or a high performing individual that doesn't have a great cultural impact, that then has a negative impact on everybody else, and you generally will find that negative impact on everybody else is greater than the positive impact of that one person or that one team. So I would tackle it the way you would tackle performance issues in general. So the leader sits down with the staff member or the team and has that serious conversation, and it then goes to be an ongoing conversation, provision of support and training where needed, looking for improvements and monitoring. And then if it doesn't improve over time, get your HR specialists involved and look at it as a serious performance discussion. To me, it's just as serious as somebody not performing in their job.
Great advice, and not an easy thing to do, but again, to commence that conversation, to create, I'll use the word awareness, to the awareness to where they are and the effect that they're having on the team.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Look, it's been an awesome chat. What advice have you got, as a bit of a parting comment, let's call it? What sort of advice have you got for some of our firms that are, we've used words like vibe or engagement, collaborative, change, positive, negative, resilience. What are some of if you've got a key piece of advice that you'd say, right, as business owner, moving to a new financial year, this is what I believe you should look at, and then look to change moving forward?
I think the key thing is to not assume, and to actually do that deep dive analysis of the culture, the qualitative and quantitative stuff that you and I spoke at the start of this interview. Do that deep dive, get a big picture idea of what are your strengths and weaknesses in terms of culture, and then work out a way forward and a strategy of how to address those weaknesses and highlight those strengths going forward. So I would say definitely as the first thing, deep dive, work out what's your culture is at, and then put those steps in place to actually address the issues.
Fantastic. And I think that's the great part, as we are entering a new financial year, we've got the ability to look at that and to share with team members why we're doing it as well. At the end of the day, we all want to grow. We all want to improve. We want the business to improve. We want the people around us to improve. At the end of the day, we want people coming to their place of work happy. That's how I've always looked at it. I've always believed in, if you're not happy, it's time to look for something else.
Absolutely.
And that's always been my mindset to growth and development. So again, great advice. It's not just me just sharing my thoughts. I know I threw myself a little bit in there as well in terms of how I look at things, but I think, Jodi, the advice that you've been able to give our listeners, our firms, just some simple little steps to think about. That's the great thing about these podcast chats. The ability now to rewind, you've got it there, you can rewind, you can read through it again, you can listen to it again, you can write your notes down, you can get team members involved. Great opportunity, maybe even get them involved in some of these aspects and say, how do you think we should deal with this? That's just me off the top of my head. So just moving forward, I think it's again, a lot of little golden nuggets that all of you listening to this can take away. So, Jodi, have you got a parting comment before we wrap up?
I would just basically say to treat this fairly seriously. The implications on the business success and the business viability long term is huge. And it's an area that is very easy to go, it's not a burning emergency now, I'll put it on the back burner. But that's where it escalates and becomes a problem that doesn't get addressed. So I would say treat this as an absolute priority and a not negotiable thing to address in the viability of your business going forward.
Yeah, well said. And I know we had a few false starts over the last few weeks, but gee, it's been an awesome chat. And I think to all of you listening to this episode of Talking Numbers, I hope that, again, it's the continued education that we're bringing to share these thoughts and ideas with you. Now it's up to you to what you do with it. You've been provided with a lot of fantastic information over the last 35 minutes, which has been awesome. So, Jodi, thank you very much. I think, again, I get the easy bit, I suppose, chatting to people that have got a passion in this area, and you've certainly got a passion in this area, so which I love. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for sharing. And
sorry, I was going to say thank you for having me on, Paul. Sorry.
No, it's all good. My pleasure. It's always great to get really good different ideas, and it's always great. So check out Jodi's stuff online if that's what you want more of. But yeah, just again, hit me up if you want Jodi's details, and I'm more than happy to pass it on. So however we can help, we will definitely help you as the business owner out there. So thanks, Jodi, and I wish you all the best for the remainder of the 21 year.
Thanks, Paul. Same to you.
Thanks, Jodi. Bye.